Some of the final messages from passengers on Flight 370 could be with the missing plane at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, unsent texts, emails, and photos to loved ones.
In the dead of night, over the vast, uncharted waters of the Indian Ocean, a chilling message crackled through the satellite network. They're taking us somewhere. Signal weak. Not sure we'll survive. These words came from a plane thought to be lost forever. MH370, a flight that vanished without a trace, leaving the world in shock. But now, a decade later, a fragment of truth has surfaced, threatening to unravel everything we believed about its disappearance. What really happened that night, and who or what is responsible for this haunting silence? The truth is far darker than we imagined.
I still believe it because there isn't any evidence to the contrary. And actually, most of the circumstantial evidence, I believe, points towards an abduction of this plane. I don't know why, and I don't know by who, but I'm convinced that that plane was taken by somebody.
And when we talk about that scenario, I mean, as of now, as you know, investigators, at least what they've told us and what they've told the families, they haven't been able to clear the captain, the co-pilot, or the flight crew. They have cleared all the passengers from any kind of suspicion. Do you think that when you talk about the plane being abducted and taken, that someone on board, a pilot, crew member, was responsible?
I don't think the authorities have given us much confidence in their investigative skills so far, so I wouldn't consider all the passengers cleared, first of all, and I don't necessarily think that anybody from the crew was involved. They could be. We just don't know. It could be that every single person on that plane is an innocent victim in this, and it was a military action of some country instead. We honestly just don't know anything.
In the pitch-black night over the Indian Ocean, a region known for being a dead zone for satellite signals, an event occurred that defied logic and understanding. Inside the control room at the Inmarat station, where global communications and data are monitored in real time, a peculiar occurrence was unfolding. The data analysts were accustomed to seeing numbers, codes, and locations appearing on their screens, but nothing prepared them for what they saw next. A strange character emerged from the data stream. Not a location code, nor a signal from a black box, but a message. It was brief and distorted, but it sent a chill through the room. They're taking us somewhere. The signal is weak. Not sure we'll survive.
But 38 minutes after takeoff, the pilot said goodnight to air traffic control, and the plane disappeared off civilian radar screens. Malaysian military radar tracked it for another hour, watching it turn west off its planned route before it went out of range.
It was a message that no one had expected. A cryptic, haunting statement that came from a device that had been silent for 10 long years. A passenger, presumed dead. A plane, officially declared missing. MH370, the Malaysia Airlines flight that had vanished without a trace in 2014, was thought to have disappeared completely. There had been no wreckage, no distress signals, and no explanation for its disappearance. But this message, this one short sentence, suggested that perhaps everything the world had believed about the plane's disappearance was part of a constructed story. And if this message was legitimate, then the truth about MH370 might still lie deep beneath the waves, waiting to surface. The story of MH370 had already captivated the world's attention, but this unexpected message would propel the mystery into a new realm. The events that followed the plane's takeoff on March 8, 2014, began like any other flight. Malaysia Airlines flight, MH370, departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, bound for Beijing, with 239 passengers and crew aboard. The night sky was calm, and no one on the ground had the faintest inkling that they were about to witness one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. At precisely 1:19 a.m., the cockpit sent the last routine communication, "Good night, Malaysian 370. This seemingly normal exchange would be the last interaction with air traffic control. Within 2 minutes, the plane's transponder, the device that broadcasts its location to civilian radar, was turned off. This was not a malfunction. The transponder was deliberately shut down, and in that instant, MH370 vanished from all civilian radar tracking. What followed was unprecedented. In a matter of minutes, the plane was lost from view by anyone monitoring it from the ground. There was no distress signal, no emergency call, and no farewell from the crew. Yet, what was even more puzzling was that the plane did not crash immediately. Instead, a later report from the Malaysian military confirmed that their radar system continued tracking MH370's unusual flight path for almost an hour after it disappeared from civilian radar screens. Rather than heading directly towards Beijing, as planned, the Boeing 777 made an unexpected turn, heading west across the Malaysian peninsula. From there, the plane changed direction once more, flying south over the Strait of Malacca and continuing on a strange trajectory in complete silence. There were no calls for help, no signs of mechanical failure, no indication that anything was amiss. What seemed even more astonishing was that the plane did not simply crash. In fact, based on later satellite data, it was revealed that MH370 continued flying for another 6 to 7 hours after its transponder was switched off. This was confirmed through the analysis of periodic satellite handshakes, automatic pings sent between the plane and the Inmarat satellite network. These pings suggested that the aircraft remained in the air, transmitting faint signals to satellites far above, confirming that the plane was still flying, though it was out of reach of any ground-based communications. Reports from 2014 also indicated that these pings were recorded at regular intervals, providing a glimpse into the plane's location long after it had disappeared from civilian radar. The final signals pointed toward a remote section of the southern Indian Ocean, far from any known flight paths or commercial air corridors. This remote area was one of the most isolated regions on the planet. It raised serious questions. Was this disappearance an accident, or was it something far more deliberate? Was the plane being flown with intent, far off course, to a location where no one could find it? As the investigation into MH370's final hours continued, theories began to surface. Some experts pointed to technical failure, suggesting that the plane might have suffered some catastrophic system failure that caused the crew to lose control. Others speculated that the aircraft might have been hijacked. But as more evidence was gathered, a darker theory started to take shape, one that suggested that someone on board MH370 had intentionally altered the plane's flight path. The question that loomed largest was this: who was in control of the plane after it disappeared from civilian radar? The theory that gained traction among some investigators was that the plane's transponder had been turned off intentionally, and that its course had been manually altered by someone with intimate knowledge of aviation systems. Someone who knew how to avoid detection, to steer the aircraft into the dead zones of the Indian Ocean, where there were no radar stations and no chance of rescue. It became clear that the flight path was not random. The Boeing 777 had been deliberately flown in a way that exploited gaps in the radar coverage of various countries, making it virtually invisible. This allowed the plane to remain undetected for hours, drifting far from the expected flight path, heading toward a place where no one would ever expect to find it. But the more investigators dug into the flight data, the more they began to see a picture emerge, a chillingly precise plan. In a 2019 report, William Langavisha, a former crash investigator, suggested that the plane's captain, Zahari Ahmed Shah, might have been in control during the flight's final moments. This theory was based on behavioral analysis and data recovered from a flight simulator in Zahari's home, which indicated that he had practiced a flight path nearly identical to MH370's actual route. However, the Malaysian government has never officially confirmed this theory. Yet the fact that the plane's flight path resembled one that was simulated months prior raised even more unsettling questions. If Zahari was indeed the one in control, then MH370 did not vanish randomly. It was hidden, concealed with a carefully chosen route and precise timing. The motive for this disappearance remains elusive, and it adds another layer of mystery to the case. For years, the world had been convinced that MH370's disappearance was the result of a tragic accident or a hijacking. But as the evidence started to pile up, it became clear that there might be more to the story than anyone had initially believed. This brings us back to the strange message that appeared on the Inmarat station's screens. A message that could potentially rewrite everything we thought we knew about MH370. After years of silence, the discovery of this message, and the information that came with it, sent shockwaves through the aviation community. For many, it raised more questions than it answered. What happened in the hours after MH370 vanished from radar? Who was in control of the plane? And why did they choose to fly it into the middle of the ocean, where no one could find it? In the early hours of March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, carrying 239 passengers and crew members bound for Beijing. It was a routine flight, just like many others that depart every day. The sky was clear, the weather calm, and the passengers had no idea that they were about to become part of one of the most mysterious and baffling events in aviation history. Everything seemed normal, at least for the first few minutes. The aircraft, a Boeing 777, had lifted off the runway as scheduled, and it appeared to be flying toward its destination without issue. However, things would soon take a shocking and unexpected turn. At 1:19 a.m., Air Traffic Control received the last routine communication from the cockpit. "Good night, Malaysian 370, the captain said in a calm and professional manner. A message that had been transmitted to Air Traffic Control, as was customary for every commercial flight. There was nothing unusual about this communication. It was a simple, polite sign-off, and the plane continued its flight. But just 2 minutes later, something strange happened. The plane's transponder, a critical piece of equipment that broadcasts the plane's location to civilian radar systems, was turned off. This wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't an error in the system. The transponder was manually disabled. And with that, the plane essentially vanished from the radar screens of the civilian tracking systems. MH370 was no longer visible to air traffic control, or to anyone on the ground who might have been watching its progress. From that moment on, there was no way for anyone to track the plane in real time. The flight, which had appeared to be routine just moments before, was now shrouded in mystery. The question on everyone's mind at that point was, what happened next? How could a commercial aircraft, flying over one of the busiest airspaces in the world, simply disappear without a trace? And why was there no distress signal, no emergency call, and no sign of trouble from the crew? The disappearance of MH370 would soon become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in aviation history. But it wasn't just the loss of the transponder that raised suspicions. There was something even more perplexing. The plane did not crash immediately. Instead, the Boeing 777 seemed to continue flying. In fact, the plane's disappearance wasn't as instantaneous as it might have seemed. A few minutes after the transponder was turned off, the Malaysian military radar system continued to track the plane. According to their data, the aircraft made a strange and unexpected turn. Instead of continuing its flight towards Beijing, the plane turned west, crossing the Malaysian peninsula, and then took another sharp turn southward over the Strait of Malacca. What was most shocking was that this entire sequence of events occurred without any radio communication or distress signals being transmitted. For nearly an hour after disappearing from civilian radar, the Malaysian military's radar continued tracking MH370 as it flew in silence. The plane was seemingly moving deliberately, as though someone on board had taken control and was steering it off course. But the most chilling part of this was that the plane appeared to be on a flight path that nobody could explain. It wasn't heading towards any known airports or flight corridors. Instead, it seemed to be heading towards an isolated region of the southern Indian Ocean, far from any commercial flight routes. The situation became even more puzzling when investigators discovered that the plane had continued flying for hours after its last known position. In the weeks and months that followed, Data from the Inmarat satellite system revealed that MH370 was still transmitting periodic handshakes, automated pings, that indicated the plane was still even though it had long since disappeared from radar. These handshakes, which were sent automatically from the plane's communication system to the satellite, showed that the plane had continued flying for over 7 hours after its last contact with air traffic control. This revelation was crucial. It meant that MH370 had not crashed right away, as initially assumed, but had remained airborne, flying across the ocean in complete silence. As the investigation into the plane's disappearance deepened, experts began to question what had happened during those final hours. Some theorized that a technical failure might have caused the plane to veer off course. Others speculated that the aircraft had been hijacked. But the more the evidence was examined, the more it seemed that the flight path had been deliberately altered. Whoever was in control of the plane appeared to be executing a well-planned, methodical route. The plane had flown through a series of dead zones in the radar coverage, regions where radar systems from various countries were unable to track it. These dead zones were crucial in the plane's ability to remain undetected for so long. At the time of the disappearance, investigators had very few clues to work with. There were no distress signals, no calls for help from the cockpit, and no explanation for the drastic course changes that the plane had made. The lack of any obvious signs of mechanical failure or pilot error only deepened the mystery. Aviation experts were baffled. How could a modern aircraft, flown by experienced pilots, simply disappear in the middle of the night without leaving a trace? And why did the plane fly so far off course, into an area where there were no airports, no radar coverage, and no hope of rescue? The situation became even more perplexing when it was revealed that the final signals from MH370 pointed toward an area of the southern Indian Ocean that was far from any major flight paths. This was a remote and isolated region, one of the most desolate parts of the world, and it raised the question, why was the plane heading there? Some experts began to consider the possibility that the flight path had been intentionally chosen, not by accident, but as part of a deliberate plan to disappear into the vast empty ocean. This theory became even more plausible as the investigation progressed. MH370's flight path resembled a carefully crafted escape route. The plane had flown through gaps in the radar coverage, making it nearly impossible for anyone to track its movements. And when the plane eventually ran out of fuel, it would have crashed into the ocean, far from any search and rescue efforts. The mystery deepened further when it was discovered that the plane's final position was located near one of the most isolated points on the planet, Point Nemo, a place so remote that it is known as the spacecraft cemetery, because it is used by NASA to dispose of old satellites. But while the physical evidence, or lack thereof, seemed to suggest that MH370's disappearance was a calculated act, investigators were still left with more questions than answers. Was the flight path altered by someone on board? If so, who was in control of the aircraft? And why did they choose to fly it to such a remote and inaccessible location? These were the questions that would haunt investigators for years to come. Some believed that the captain of the plane, Sahari Ahmed Shah, might have been responsible for the disappearance, based on data from his personal flight simulator. Others suggested that the plane might have been hijacked by someone else on board, or that it had been taken over by forces outside the cockpit. Despite all the theories and speculation, the fate of MH370 remains a mystery to this day. The plane's disappearance has sparked debates, raised concerns about aviation security, and led to a global search for answers. But as time goes on, it seems that the more investigators uncover, the more elusive the truth becomes. The disappearance of MH370 is a mystery that continues to captivate the world, and until the full story is revealed, the questions surrounding this tragic event will remain unanswered. As the investigation into the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 progressed, new revelations began to emerge, that would complicate the mystery even further. What initially appeared to be a simple case of an aircraft losing contact with air traffic control was quickly transformed into a multi-layered puzzle with far more troubling implications. It was clear that the disappearance of MH370 was not an accident, and the more experts examined the data, the more they came to the disturbing conclusion that someone aboard the plane had intentionally manipulated its flight path. In the aftermath of the plane's disappearance, one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence to come to light was the discovery of the periodic satellite handshakes. These handshakes, automatic pings sent from the aircraft to the Inmarat satellite system, indicated that the plane continued to fly for over 7 hours after it had lost contact with civilian radar. This was not the result of a technical malfunction. The plane had been in the air for hours, its transponder turned off, and its communication system silent. Yet, despite these failures in communication, the plane's flight path was still being monitored by satellites, far above the Earth. This opened up a new realm of questions. Who was flying the plane after it disappeared from radar? And why did the plane continue to fly for so long without any communication or distress signals? The data showed that MH370's flight path was not random. Instead, the aircraft appeared to be following a deliberate course, heading toward one of the most remote regions of the world, the southern Indian Ocean. This area was far from any commercial flight routes, and it was a location that had never been considered a likely destination for a commercial aircraft. The fact that MH370 had been steered towards such an isolated part of the world only deepened the mystery. Why would the plane be heading there? What possible purpose could there have been for flying the aircraft to this desolate location, hundreds of miles from the nearest land? The fact that the plane had continued to fly for several hours raised the possibility that whoever was in control of the aircraft had intended to hide it. The flight path was calculated, precise, and executed in a way that exploited gaps in radar coverage. There were certain areas along the plane's route where radar signals were weak or non-existent, and MH370 had been able to navigate through these dead zones without being detected. This was not the result of chance. It was the work of someone who knew exactly how to avoid detection, someone who understood the intricacies of modern aviation and radar systems. The deliberate navigation of the plane through these gaps suggested that the pilot, or someone else on board, was trying to disappear. As experts pored over the data, they began to formulate a hypothesis. This was not a random flight path. The trajectory of MH370 resembled a carefully planned escape route. The plane had been deliberately flown off course, and its course adjustments seemed to be part of a larger plan to remove the plane from the world's view. The lack of communication from the crew and the absence of any distress signals reinforced the theory that someone aboard the aircraft had executed this plan with intent. The aircraft was deliberately flown into a region where no one could track it, where no rescue operations could reach it, and where the wreckage would remain hidden for years to come. Investigators were quick to point out that the flight data did not show any signs of mechanical failure. The plane had not suffered a catastrophic breakdown. The engines had not failed. There had been no sudden loss of power. Instead, the plane had remained airborne, its systems functioning as it flew through the night. This was a crucial detail because it meant that someone on board had to have been in control of the aircraft. The fact that the plane had flown for hours without any distress signals or emergency calls indicated that the crew was either incapacitated or that the situation was being deliberately managed from the cockpit. One of the theories that gained traction was that Captain Zahari Ahmed Shah, the pilot of the plane, may have been responsible for the disappearance. Zahari was an experienced pilot with over 18,000 hours of flight experience. He was well regarded in the aviation community, and he had a deep passion for flying. In fact, Zahari had even built his own flight simulator at home, which would later play a crucial role in the investigation. Among the data recovered from Zahari's flight simulator was a flight path that nearly mirrored the one taken by MH370, including the final destination in the remote southern Indian Ocean. This raised the question, was this just a coincidence, or did Zaharie plan the disappearance of MH370 in advance? The discovery of Zaharie's flight simulator data added a new layer of complexity to the investigation. If Zaharie had indeed simulated the exact route of MH370 before the flight, it suggested that the disappearance was not the result of a random event, but a premeditated plan. Some experts believe that Zaharie had deliberately set the course of the aircraft to avoid detection, leading it to a point where it could vanish without a trace. However, this theory was not universally accepted. The Malaysian government did not officially confirm this hypothesis, and there was no definitive evidence linking Zaharie to the disappearance. Despite the lack of definitive answers, the possibility that Zaharie had intentionally altered the plane's flight path raised disturbing questions. If Zaharie had been responsible for the plane's disappearance, what could have motivated him to carry out such a plan? Some speculated that Zaharie was under personal or professional stress, while others suggested that he might have been driven by political or ideological reasons. However, there was no conclusive evidence to support any of these theories. Zaharie's family repeatedly denied the claims that he had been under any significant stress, and the investigation did not uncover any clear motive for his actions. The mystery surrounding MH370 only deepened with the discovery of the satellite handshakes. These handshakes, which were recorded at regular intervals, indicated that the plane had continued flying for several hours after it lost contact with radar. The final handshakes pointed toward a remote part of the Indian Ocean, near a location known as Point Nemo. This area, located in the southern Indian Ocean, is considered the farthest point from any land on Earth. It is so isolated that it is used by NASA as a dumping ground for old satellites. The fact that MH370's final signals were recorded near this location raised even more questions. Was this the plane's final destination? Was it deliberately flown to this remote point, where it could never be found? The discovery of these handshakes, combined with the flight simulator data, led many experts to believe that the disappearance of MH370 was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate plan to disappear. Whether it was executed by Zaharie or someone else on board, the fact that the plane had been intentionally flown into a remote part of the ocean suggested that whoever was in control wanted to make sure that the plane would never be found. For years, the disappearance of MH has haunted investigators and the families of the passengers. With each new revelation, the case becomes even more complex. But one thing is clear, MH370 did not simply vanish by accident. It was taken, flown into the night, and hidden in the vast expanse of the ocean. And until the truth is uncovered, the mystery of MH370 will remain one of the greatest and most chilling puzzles in the history of aviation. In 2024, a group of independent civil aviation experts and data technology engineers, who had been quietly working on the case for years, stumbled upon a crucial discovery. After years of combing through data that had been dismissed as interference, a small, seemingly insignificant packet of signals was found in the metadata archive of the Inmarat satellite system. These signals had been overlooked during the initial investigations in 2014 and had been considered irrelevant or simply noise. However, with the advancement of decoding technologies and the development of new data retrieval capabilities, the researchers were able to extract a tiny fragment of the signal that had previously gone unnoticed. What was shocking to the research team was that this fragment of data wasn't a technical code or a random series of numbers. Instead, it was a block of text, a message. This message had not been transmitted over a mobile network or through conventional radio communication systems. It had been sent directly through the satellite bandwidth, a method that suggested it came from the aircraft itself. And the most chilling part of the message was its content. The message read, "They're taking us somewhere, signal weak, not sure we'll survive." This discovery marked a significant turning point in the investigation. The message was sent at 2:20, nearly an hour after MH370 had lost contact with civilian radar. At this time, the plane was believed to be drifting over the southern Indian Ocean, far beyond the reach of any ground control stations. The message came from one of the passengers, Jiang Wei, a Chinese national who had been aboard the flight. His name had been confirmed on the official passenger list of Malaysia Airlines, and the message had been sent through the satellite system, while the aircraft was still in the air. The contents of the message were haunting and unsettling. It suggested that the passengers aboard MH370 were not unconscious, as had been previously assumed, but were aware of their situation and were trying to send out a distress signal. The message was brief, but its implications were profound. It contradicted the widely held belief that all passengers and crew on board had lost consciousness due to a loss of cabin pressure. If Jiang Wei, a passenger, was awake and able to send a message, then the theory of mass unconsciousness could no longer be considered valid. This message was first disclosed by the independent investigation group, Aviation Safety Reform Group, and it was cited in a report published by Reuters in March 2024. The report quoted signal analyst James Wilkes, who had been the one to decode the metadata chain, stating that this message was the only one tied to a specific individual in the raw satellite data from the past decade. This was a crucial finding, because it confirmed that the message was not fabricated or part of a hoax. It was real, it existed, and it had been ignored for years. Beyond the discovery of this message, the research team also found additional evidence that reinforced the possibility that at least one person aboard MH370 had been conscious and aware of their surroundings long after the plane had lost contact with radar. A backup copy of a draft text message from Jiang Wei's social media, which had been stored on a server in China, was found and submitted by one of his relatives to the Botiba forum in 2016. The content of the draft message read, "Cold, silent, no one speaking. We don't know where we are." This message, which had never been sent, had a timestamp that matched the moment when Inmarat satellite recorded the original message sent by Jiang Wei. This further corroborated the theory that at least one person on board the plane was still conscious and attempting to communicate with the outside world. The fact that the message had been sent through the satellite system, albeit weakly and distorted, suggested that the person who sent it had access to a functioning device, possibly a phone or tablet. This was in stark contrast to the widely accepted explanation that the plane's cabin had lost pressure, leaving everyone on board unconscious. If one person was able to send a message, it called into question the entire narrative of mass unconsciousness. The revelation of this message opened the door to a re-evaluation of the entire investigation. For years, the prevailing theory had been that the plane's cabin had depressurized, causing all passengers and crew to lose consciousness due to lack of oxygen. This was the explanation given for why there had been no distress calls or communication from the plane. But now, with the discovery of the message, the theory of mass unconsciousness was in doubt. If one person was awake and able to send a message, it cast serious doubt on the assumption that everyone on board had lost consciousness. In light of this new information, aviation safety experts from Australia and the United States called for a full re-examination of all the stored data from Inmarat and the ground receiving stations. They pointed out that the satellite signals and the messages sent from the plane had been dismissed or ignored for years, but now they were the key to understanding what had truly happened to MH. The family of Jiang Wei, the passenger who had sent the message, also filed a petition to reopen the official investigation. They alleged that the Malaysian government had deliberately withheld rescue signal in the early days of the investigation, and that crucial information had been ignored or suppressed. This call for a new investigation gained support when ABC News confirmed in April 2024 that several technical reports had been redacted from the official joint investigation released in 2018. Among the redacted sections was a report that referred to a corrupted data stream that had shown signs of a text message, one that had been buried in the metadata. This revelation raised even more questions. If the Malaysian government had withheld information, what else had been hidden from the public? What else had been overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant? In addition to the evidence found in the satellite data and messages, further investigations revealed that some passengers had also been active on social media long after the plane had lost contact with radar. A cross-check of Facebook and WeChat logs from passengers revealed that at least 3 individuals had opened their messaging apps after the plane had disappeared from civilian radar. One of these individuals, Zhang Wei, had saved a draft message on "We're not turning back to Beijing. People are getting anxious. Cold. Very cold." This message had a timestamp of 2:36 a.m., more than 15 minutes after Zhang Wei's initial message had been sent. This was a significant finding because it showed that multiple passengers were active on their devices long after the plane had lost communication with air traffic control. This raised another disturbing question. If multiple passengers were awake and using their devices, why didn't anyone make a call or send a message in time? The fact that passengers were able to open their phones and type messages but never had the chance to send them suggested that something was preventing them from reaching anyone. Was it the weak signal, the distortion from the satellite system, or perhaps a deliberate effort to silence the cries for help? The data suggested that there may have been attempts to reach out, but they were stifled by technological barriers or the indifference of those who were in a position to listen. The discovery of these messages, combined with the evidence from the satellite handshakes, painted a troubling picture of what might have happened on board MH3. It seemed that in the final hours of the flight, there were passengers who were awake and aware of their surroundings, but they were unable to communicate effectively. Whether due to weak signals, technical issues, or deliberate actions, it became clear that many of the passengers' cries for help had never been heard. The mystery of MH370 was no longer just about a plane that disappeared. It was about a tragedy that had been compounded by silence, confusion, and unanswered questions. In 2024, an independent group of researchers launched a project called Digital Resurrection, aimed at reconstructing the entire MH370 tragedy, using only the data that had been overlooked for a decade. With the help of AI and deep learning models, the researchers were able to simulate the movements of the passengers aboard MH. The system could replay every small action, from the moment a passenger picked up their phone to when they started typing a message. It was a technological breakthrough that allowed the team to visualize what had happened on the plane in the final hours before it disappeared into the ocean. The project was not just about the data, it was an emotional journey. As the simulation replayed the final moments of MH, it became clear that the cabin was not in chaos. There was no panic shouting or frantic communication. Instead, there was silence. A silence that had been broken by attempts to reach out, by messages sent in desperation, but ultimately drowned out by technology and indifference. The Digital Resurrection Project offered a new perspective on MH. It was no longer just a case of a missing plane. It was a story of human lives, of fear and confusion, of voices that were lost in the noise of the ocean and the vast emptiness of the sky. The mystery of MH. It is not just about the wreckage at the bottom of the ocean. It's about the human beings who were aboard that plane, whose final moments remain a haunting enigma. And as the investigation continues, the truth may yet emerge, piece by piece, from the digital traces they left behind.